the scene and the time of the MTV Music Awards.
Thank you.
And Axl Rose walked by us. And we yelled at Axl. We said, "Axl, will you be the godfather of our child?"
I have to be honest, I really didn't like the Replacements when I was into punk rock music. I listened to them. I liked the sound of it, and I don't know if that, I think my appreciation for R.E.M. and the Beatles and stuff like that had more to do with it, because I really wasn't aware of.
Nirvana wasn't just a band, they were a revolution. Their raw energy, powerful lyrics, and refusal to play by the rules didn't just change music, they changed rock culture. Offstage, they were just as real and fearless. They stood up for what they believed in and never faked it. Not for fame, not for radio play, not for anyone. They knew exactly who they didn't want to share a stage with. So here are 7 bands Nirvana refused to tour with, and the reasons might just surprise you. Coming in at number 7 is Pearl Jam. Both Nirvana and Pearl Jam came straight out of Seattle. Their raw, emotional, guitar-fueled music became the blueprint for the whole grunge scene. From the outside, they looked like natural allies. However, behind the scenes, a huge rift was opening up, largely driven by Kurt Cobain's incredibly outspoken views. In fact, that tension started long before Pearl Jam was even a band. Some of Pearl Jam's members, Stone Gossard and Jeff Ament, were once in a band called Green River with Mark Arm from Mudhoney. Green River broke up because of creative differences. Gossard and Ament wanted a more commercial sound, while Mark Arm and the others wanted to stay true to the underground punk scene. Kurt was a huge fan of Mark Arm, so when Gossard and Ament left to form what eventually became Pearl Jam, he saw it as a total sellout of the core values that defined the Seattle scene. To Kurt, Pearl Jam were competitors, too polished, too professional, and not true to the punk spirit. He called them corporate puppets that are just trying to jump on the alternative bandwagon. In one MTV interview, when asked about Eddie Vedder, Kurt said, "We've never had a fight ever. I've just always hated his band." In 1992, he told Flipside magazine, "Those bands have been in the hairspray, cock rock scene for years. And all of a sudden they stop washing their hair and start wearing flannel shirts. It doesn't make any sense to me." To Kurt, Pearl Jam was just copying the look of grunge, but they completely missed the point of the whole movement. He said, "There are bands moving to Seattle from Los Angeles and then claiming they've lived here all their life just to get record deals. It really offends me." The media loved the feud. Every interview turned into a Nirvana versus Pearl Jam question, and Kurt kept feeding the fire with more quotes. Pearl Jam rarely fired back, which probably frustrated him even more. Even Jeff Ament later admitted that the media exaggerated the whole thing, saying, "Kurt was talking shit about us, and we talked a little shit back." Every interview, the second or third question was about Nirvana, and I'm sure they were getting the same about us. Because of all that bad blood, Nirvana always refused to go on a joint tour with them during their peak. At number 6, we have Rush. The Canadian prog rock giants once wanted Nirvana to open for them, but Kurt had zero interest in playing for that kind of crowd. In 1991, Rush was promoting their album Roll the Bones, which had become a huge success, reaching number 3 on the US charts. They were planning a massive tour across North America and Europe that would run from October 1991 to July 1992. This was right around the time Nevermind was exploding, turning Nirvana into the hottest band in the world. Rush's management thought it would be perfect to have Nirvana as their opening act. It made sense on paper. Take the biggest new band and put them in front of Rush's massive, loyal fan base. The tour would have been huge for Nirvana, giving them access to arenas full of rock fans. But Kurt Cobain wasn't interested. In an interview with Gilbert Blechen, Kurt confirmed that Rush had invited Nirvana to tour with them. He said, "Yeah, and Rush, Skid Row, and a bunch of others also asked us. Those kind of bands?" The rejection must have been tough for Dave Grohl, who was a huge Rush fan. Grohl admired their drummer, Neil Peart, and saw him as a major influence. After Peart died, Grohl called him an inspiration to millions, with an unmistakable sound who spawned generations of musicians to pick up 2 sticks and chase a dream. But Kurt didn't care about Grohl's fandom. He had bigger issues with what accepting the Rush tour would mean. For Kurt, it wasn't about the music. It was about control and authenticity. He didn't want Nirvana to be just another opening act, even for a legendary band like Rush. He wanted them to headline their own shows in smaller venues where they could connect with their fans directly. Kurt was also suspicious of prog rock's pretentious reputation. Rush represented everything he disliked about 1970s rock: long songs, complex arrangements, and fans who cared more about technical skill than raw emotion. This went against everything Nirvana stood for with their simple, powerful song. Kurt's decision to turn down Rush proved just how committed he was to his vision. He'd rather fill small theaters on his own terms than play massive arenas as someone else's opening act. That mindset would lead him to turn down even bigger offers later on. Coming in at number 5, it's Guns N' Roses. And let me tell you, their story went way beyond just typical band drama. It was an all-out war between two massive rock egos that ended up defining an entire era. In the early 1990s, Guns N' Roses was the biggest rock band on the planet. They were loud, wild, and led by the unpredictable Axl Rose. At the same time, Nirvana was exploding from the underground. They were like night and day compared to Guns N' Roses. Axl Rose was actually an early fan of Nirvana. He loved their music and wore a Nirvana hat in their Don't Cry music video. In 1992, Metallica and Guns N' Roses were planning one of the biggest rock tours ever, but they needed an opening band that could match their star power. Axl Rose had a brilliant idea. Why not ask Nirvana to join them? Kurt Cobain was already ruling the music world. Their album, Nevermind, was dominating the charts and basically made Nirvana the biggest thing going. But when Hammett called Kurt about the tour, things didn't go as planned. He said, "I had to make the phone call to Kurt to talk to him about the possibility of joining our tour." And he just went on and on about how he just didn't like what Guns N' Roses stood for. Hammett tried to convince Kurt to change his mind. He told him, "Just go out there and represent Nirvana. Just play the show and then that's it." Kurt, however, just flat out refused. For Kurt, it wasn't just about music, it was about values. Guns N' Roses represented everything he hated about rock music, like the drum and the way they treated their fans. In one interview, Kurt said, "When you're a popular figure, you owe a certain responsibility to your fans. I think Guns N' Roses are promoting the wrong values, like them and the way they do. I mean, what are they rebelling against? I don't think this is rebellion. Rebellion is standing up to people like Guns N' Roses." Axl didn't take the rejection well. He went on the attack in Metallica's magazine, saying, "Nirvana would rather stay at home and shoot heroin with their bitch wives than tour with us." Things exploded at the 1992 MTV Video Music Awards when both bands were there. Axl confronted Kurt backstage after Courtney Love sarcastically asked him to be the godfather to their child. Later that night, Dave Grohl taunted Axl from the stage, shouting, "Where's Axl? Hi Axl," after their performance. The tour turned into everything Kurt predicted. There were riots, late starts, and complete chaos. In Montreal, fans started a full-scale riot that caused $400,000 in damages after Axl walked off stage early because of a sore throat. So these are the reasons Nirvana refused to tour with Guns N' Roses. At number 4, we have Skid Row, one of the late 80s hair metal bands. In 1991, Skid Row were riding high from their album Slave to the Grind, a #1 heavy metal record. They even opened for Guns N' Roses on a massive tour. But by 1991, Nirvana's popularity was also exploding, and bands like Skid Row were eager to have them on board. In 1991, Skid Row invited Nirvana to join their world tour after the success of their album Slave to the Grind. Kurt Cobain, however, turned down those kinds of offers right away. For Nirvana, Skid Row and bands like them were everything they stood against. The glam metal scene was notorious for its misogynistic and homophobic attitudes, things Kurt Cobain found completely repugnant. A famous example of this came when Skid Row's singer, Sebastian Bach, went on stage wearing a t-shirt that has slogan like "AIDS fags dead." It was a shockingly hateful slogan, and Cobain, who was a vocal ally of women and the LGBTQ+ community, was disgusted by that kind of behavior. He didn't want Nirvana associated with bands that embodied what he called toxic machismo. Kurt Cobain's stance against homophobia was well documented. In a 1992 Flipside magazine interview, he made a powerful statement by saying, "I'd like to get rid of the homophobes, racists, and in our audience. I know they're out there, and it really bothers me. So, at this point, I have a request for our fans. If any of you in any way hate people of a different color, or women, please do us one favor. Don't come to our shows and don't buy our records." Kurt Cobain openly confirmed turning down multiple tour offers in several interviews. In a 1991 conversation with Gilbert Blecken, he casually mentioned Rush, Skid Row, and a bunch of others also asked us to tour. We don't really want to play in huge arenas supporting someone. By refusing to tour with Skid Row, Nirvana sent a clear message. They weren't about to join the hair metal circus just because it was popular. They were carving out a new path for rock, one that rejected the excess and arrogance of the previous decade. So those were the reasons Nirvana refused to tour with Skid Row, a principled stand against the toxic attitudes of the glam metal scene. At number 3, we have Ozzy Osbourne. The Prince of Darkness wanted Nirvana to join what he believed would be his final tour, but Kurt had other plans. In the early 1990s, Ozzy Osbourne was going through a health scare. Doctors had diagnosed him with multiple sclerosis, a serious disease that affects the brain and spinal cord. Because of this scary diagnosis, Ozzy decided to retire from touring. He announced what he called the No More Tours, a farewell run that would be his last time performing live. The tour was named after his recent album No More Tears and was supposed to be Ozzy's way of saying goodbye to his fans. It was going to be a big deal with huge production and all the classic Ozzy theatrics. For any opening act, it would have been the chance of a lifetime to play in front of massive crowds and be part of rock history. Ozzy's team reached out to Nirvana about joining the tour. This was when Nirvana was just starting to blow up, and it seemed like the perfect match. Ozzy was metal royalty, and Nirvana was the hottest new band in rock. The combination could have been explosive, but Kurt Cobain wasn't interested in the offer. When he spoke with Gilbert Blechen, he explained his reasoning, saying, "He also asked us to go on tour with him, but we turned it down. It would have been fun and kind of exciting to be part of his last shows, but we don't really want to play in huge arenas supporting someone." For Kurt, the issue wasn't personal. He seemed to have real respect for what Ozzy had achieved over the years. Calling it potentially fun and kind of exciting showed that Kurt understood the significance of the tour, but he had principles about how Nirvana should be presented to the world. Kurt didn't want Nirvana to be just another opening act. Even for someone as legendary as Ozzy, he believed the band's music was best experienced in smaller, more intimate venues where they could connect directly with their audience. Playing massive arenas as a support act would have diluted that experience. There was also the question of audience compatibility. Ozzy's fans were mostly into traditional heavy metal, while Nirvana was creating something completely different. Kurt might have worried that their music wouldn't translate to that crowd, or that they'd be seen as just a warm-up act instead of the revolutionary force they were becoming. Years later, Ozzy found out that his diagnosis was wrong. He didn't actually have multiple sclerosis. He continued touring and performing for decades after his supposed farewell tour. But at the time, turning down what seemed like Ozzy's final tour was a big decision. Ozzy later admitted he barely remembered meeting Kurt Cobain. It wasn't until Dave Grohl reminded him years later that Ozzy said, "Apparently I met Kurt because I was talking to Dave Grohl and he said, 'You probably don't remember this, but when you were in Devonshire Studios in the Valley, me and Kurt were in the room where they had a pool table. When you walked in, we were like, hell.'" So these are the reasons Nirvana refused to tour with Ozzy Osbourne. At number 2, we have Metallica. Nirvana even turned down an opportunity to tour with the biggest metal band of the era. Back in 1992, Metallica and Guns N' Roses planned a massive co-headlining stadium tour and personally invited Nirvana to be the opening act. From Metallica's perspective, adding Nirvana, the hottest new band in rock, would have made for an unstoppable lineup. Metallica's guitarist Kirk Hammett was the one who called Kurt Cobain to extend the invitation. Surprisingly, Cobain said no. Hammett said, "I had to make the phone call to Kurt to talk to him about the possibility of joining our tour, and he just went on and on about how he just didn't like what Guns N' Roses stood for. I said to him, just go out there and represent Nirvana. Just play the show and then that's it." I pleaded with him, but he just wasn't having it. So there you have it. It would have been great if Nirvana was part of that tour. That's the key point. Nirvana's refusal wasn't about Metallica at all. It was because the tour was tied to Guns N' Roses, a band Cobain couldn't stand. Hammett even tried to reason with him, suggesting Nirvana could just go out there and represent Nirvana on stage and ignore the rest of the drama. But Kurt just wasn't having it. Ironically, Cobain actually liked Metallica. He was a fan of their early music. He once asked Hammett if Metallica would play Whiplash, telling him, "That's my favorite Metallica song." He even attended a Metallica show in 1992 and hung out in the VIP area with Courtney Love. So there was never a personal feud between Nirvana and Metallica. In fact, the bands got along well. Dave Grohl later said Kurt and the Metallica guys were friendly and had mutual respect for each other. The irony, of course, is that Nirvana had to turn down their friends in Metallica simply because they didn't want to share a bill with Guns N' Roses. Hammett said he understood Cobain's feelings, though he was disappointed. Nirvana chose to skip what could have been one of the most high-profile tours in rock history, just to avoid being linked with a band they didn't respect. So we have added Metallica to the list as well, since they're another band Nirvana refused to tour with. And finally, at number 1 is Lollapalooza, 1994. It wasn't a band, it was a movement. But Kurt's decision to turn down Lollapalooza 1994 said it all. He couldn't like the idea of selling out. Lollapalooza was the biggest alternative music festival in America. Perry Farrell from Jane's Addiction had created it in 1991 as a farewell tour for his band, but it became something much bigger. By 1994, Lollapalooza was the place where the coolest bands played for huge audiences. Getting the headlining slot was like winning the lottery. Nirvana was the obvious choice to headline Lollapalooza in 1994. They were the biggest band in alternative rock, and their presence would guarantee sold-out shows across the country. The festival organizers were practically begging them to do it. The money was incredible. Estimates range from $6 to $9 million for the tour. But Kurt Cobain was terrified of what Lollapalooza represented. He saw it as the ultimate sellout moment. John Rubelli, who was booking the festival at the time, said, "Kurt was terrified of selling out, and Lola was a sellout moment, I think, for them. Kurt's fear went deeper than just money. He was worried about the audience he'd be playing for," Rubelli said. He very clearly at that point was talking about how he looked in the audience, and he saw all of the people that were beating him up in school. The festival would attract mainstream rock fans, exactly the kind of people Kurt felt had rejected him as a teenager. In a rare interview, Cobain was asked if he'd ever been tempted by anything since becoming successful. He said, "No, not that I can think of, except for Lollapalooza. They offered us a guarantee of like $6 million, and that's way more money than we're gonna break even on this tour because of playing in theaters." The pressure to do Lollapalooza was enormous. Everyone around Kurt wanted him to take the deal. His wife Courtney Love was pushing for it, arguing that Nirvana needed the career boost and the money. His management team saw it as the perfect opportunity. Even his bandmates Dave Grohl and Chris Novoselic thought it would be good for the band, but Kurt kept resisting. He didn't want to perform in a festival environment where Nirvana would be just one band among many. He preferred the control of their own tours, where they could create the entire experience for their fans. There was also the question of what Lollapalooza had become. When it started, it was about showcasing underground and alternative music, but by 1994, it was becoming more mainstream and commercial. Kurt worried that playing the festival would make Nirvana part of that commercialization. Then in February 1994, Kurt gave an interview, and for the first time, it sounded like he might have changed his mind. He said, "We're going to be doing Lollapalooza." This was confusing because everything else suggested he hated the idea. But behind the scenes, Kurt was falling apart. He was struggling with addiction, depression, and the pressure of fame. In March 1994, he overdosed in Rome and had to be hospitalized. When he came back to Seattle, there was an intervention, and he was sent to rehab. Kurt escaped from the rehab facility by climbing over a wall. A few days later, on April 5, 1994, he took his own life. Nirvana's withdrawal from Lollapalooza was announced on April 6, just 2 days before Kurt's body was discovered. Perry Farrell said, "I had heard that Kurt escaped from a rehab and they were actually wondering if I knew where he was. I did not know where he was, and then a few days later they told me that he had shot himself." The Lollapalooza situation perfectly captured Kurt's internal struggle with success. He wanted to make money and provide for his family, but he also wanted to stay true to his artistic vision. The festival represented everything he was afraid fame would turn him into, so that was the list of bands Nirvana flat out refused to tour. From rock legends to rising stars, these stories reveal the moments when Kurt Cobain took a stand for what he believed in, no matter the fame or fortune involved. If you enjoyed learning about these iconic feuds, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story of rock history.